Hi everyone, welcome to this reading and Q&A. It's going to be the talk titled Discussion on Animals, Robots, Gods, Adventures in the Moral Imagination. I'd like to welcome Webb Keane. He is the George Herbert Mead Distinguished University Professor at University of Michigan and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A sociocultural and linguistic anthropologist, he has authored, co-authored, and edited 6 books, including Animals, Robots, Gods, Adventures in Moral Imagination and Ethical Life, Its Natural and Social Histories. In addition to his work in Indonesia, he has written extensively on comparative problems in semiotics, linguistic pragmatics, religion, moral economy, and social theory.
First of all, I thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this fascinating conference. Basically, I was asked to present part of this new book of mine called Animals, Robots, Gods, Adventures in the Moral Imagination. Um, what I'm about to do, what I'm about to say here is possibly quite orthogonal to much of the discussion that you all have been participating in today and yesterday. The book itself is about some of the moral problems that arise when humans encounter human-like entities at the borders or just beyond the borders of the human, and the kinds of challenges they pose to our assumptions about what a human being is. So it starts off by talking about humans essentially in vegetative states or in comas who are clearly humans but are unable to respond to us. It moves on to animals, which is the part I will be talking about today, and from there to robots and on to artificial intelligence. The way it is possibly orthogonal to much of what has been going on here is that as an anthropologist, my concern is that many of the questions that we ask in these kinds of situations, questions about animal rights, questions about the possible sentience of AI and so forth, uh, are formulated and predicated almost overwhelmingly on the basic worldview and assumptions of uh, people like us in the largely what is often described as the weird world, that is to say, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Most people are not actually part of that world, and throughout most of human history, nobody was part of that world. So the kinds of claims that we want to make about humans and the questions we might ask of near humans or quasi-humans, I think need to be broadened. We need to broaden our scope. So the strategy that I, as an anthropologist, take is to pose the kinds of questions that we've been asking, not as another case in analytic philosophy or in engineering technology or something like that, but to bring it to folks outside of the familiar world, the world closest at hand, and ask how other people respond to ask these questions and try to answer them. So that's the introduction then to what I'd like to do now, which is simply to read from chapter 3 of Animals, Robots, Gods. And it segues from the previous chapter, which is about the problem of our moral relations to other humans who are unable to respond to us because they're in comas, vegetative states, and largely kept alive by machines. I begin by referring back to that chapter. A grandmother on life support in a vegetative state is an example of what some philosophers call a marginal case. She doesn't seem to have any subjective awareness of her condition, hopes for the future, desires, or memories. She is not a rational being able to decide what is right and wrong. As a result, she fails the test that some philosophers use to decide who counts as a full moral subject. Now, as her grandchild, of course, you might strenuously object. So do many philosophers. And the preceding chapter attempts to show why. But what about animals? Alice Crary, a moral philosopher, writes that if we are disturbed by the idea that we should exclude from our moral concern marginal cases, like the patient in a vegetative state or a child with a severe cognitive disability, then we may equally well be disturbed by the idea that animals only merit moral consideration insofar as they have such and such individual characteristic. especially rationality. Now, the philosophers, activists, and legal theorists who worry about animal rights mostly argue about what criteria we should use for including an animal in our moral sphere: their sentience, their capacity to suffer, their ecological value. They do not, however, disagree much about what animals are or how we differ from them. But are we sure we know what they are? Could we learn something from other perspectives from beyond the background shared by these philosophers, activists, and legal theorists? Consider two examples from anthropologist fieldwork. In 2010, Radhika Govindarajan was living in a village in Uttarakhand in the Indian Himalayas. After dangerous floods, she accompanied an aid worker trying to persuade an old woman to relocate from her severely damaged house. The woman refused to leave her Jersey cow, explaining she is sad because of what has happened. She knows when I am anxious, and she also becomes anxious. Such is love. I will stay here. So what if my family is not here? These animals are my family too. Now, you might think that this is a familiar kind of sentimentality, something you could find just as easily in Yorkshire or Michigan, but let's look a bit closer. These same villagers painstakingly raise goats, which they eventually sacrifice to local deities. They do not enjoy inflicting pain on the animals with whom they have been intimate and sometimes mourn their loss. But Govindarajan was told several times that in the mountains, goats and people are related because they are both subject to the same local gods. Therefore, a goat from the mountains will understand why you are sacrificing it to those gods, unlike goats from the valleys. Still, this does not mean it is easy to kill them. One woman tells her, "Do you know how much labor it takes to raise animals? It pains me every time I see one of them die. But as sacrifice, they repay the debt of my maternal love. The goats," she says, "are willing participants in their own sacrifice." These are the words of people who regularly kill animals, yet whose sense of relatedness to those very creatures may well go deeper than that of many animal rights activists. People's close bonds with animals hardly keep them from killing them. Often the opposite is true. Identification of human and animal can go in many directions. If the Jersey cow and the sacrificial goat are both domesticated intimates of the humans who raise them, some societies breach both the human-animal distinction and that between wild and tame. Hanna Willislev is an anthropologist of Yukagir hunters in Siberia, people who largely rely on game for food. Their success in the hunt depends heavily on their ability to mimic, and, some say, even transform into their prey. Here, Willislev recounts joining an experienced hunter stalking an elk. Disguised in an elk hide, the old man began rocking back and forth. He seemed to be transformed, becoming simultaneously man and elk. This attracted the attention of a female elk and calf who walked towards him, thereby allowing him to shoot them. As the old man later explained, I saw two persons dancing towards me. The mother was a beautiful young woman, and while singing, she said, "Honored friend, come, and I'll take you by the arm and lead you to our home." At that point, I killed them both. Had I gone with her, I myself would have died. She would have killed me. And indeed, as Willerset tells us, some hunters go too far in their identification with elk or bears and never fully regain their humanity after the hunt. In both cases, that of Indian farmers and of Yukagir hunters, a strong sense of identification, even a moral bond between human and animal, does not preclude killing, nor does it obscure potential conflict between them. The elk might kill the hunter. As we will see, that moral bond may even require that humans kill animals, or, as some say, that animals voluntarily give themselves up to be killed. Looking at the major contemporary arguments for animals' rights, The moral philosopher Elizabeth Anderson notes that they are based on different values. Some stress the suffering of the animal, others an expansive concept of rights, and still others the overall health of ecosystems. Anderson insists that we shouldn't try to force these values into neat alignment. I would add that we cannot do so, because, among other things, values do not exist in isolation. They both reflect and depend on a way of life. This is one of the key lessons we should take from these stories. As I noted before, you simply cannot live out the values of a Carmelite nun without a monastic system, or a Mongolian warrior without a cavalry, and the respective social, economic, and cultural systems that sustain them and acknowledge their worth. We cannot make sense of ethics or expect them of others without understanding what makes them inhabitable, possible ways to live. And we should neither expect nor, I think, hope that the diversity of ways of life will somehow converge into one best way of living. The policymakers, activists, lawyers, and academics hashing out the terms of animal rights and environmentalism largely inhabit a certain way of life. Their debates mostly take place among a small subset of the tribe weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And although they may differ on which values they emphasize, they share a rough consensus about the distinctions between animals and humans. No doubt they reject Descartes' view that animals are a kind of machine. Many will also agree that primates, at least, and maybe whales, displace some social responses that resemble sympathy. But with some important exceptions, and some quarrels about detail, few stray very far from Charles Darwin's view. Even though his revolutionary ideas put humans firmly in the natural world, he nonetheless insisted there remains one crucial difference between us and other animals. That is the sense of morality, which he considered the most important principle of human action. Animals may be proper objects of our moral concern, but surely a creature guided by instinct is not fully able to live in light of certain ideals. Nor need you be secular to take morality to be the key to human exceptionalism. As the Bangladeshi Muslims explained to anthropologist Navida Khan, although animals must be respected, only humans will face Judgment Day, because only humans have a conscience. Few Western animal rights advocates are likely to say, as Balinese farmers do, that if farmers do not steal from their neighboring monkeys, the monkeys should know that they ought to reciprocate and not steal from them. Unless they are Buddhists, they will not base their arguments on the premise that animals can be reborn as humans, capable of morality. Even if they hold that animals deserve dignity, they do not forbid laughing at them, lest trees fall or lightning strike, like Malaysia's Chewang people, or avoid boasting about their hunting prowess in front of their dead prey, like the Canadian Cree. They are unlikely to accept Sophie Chow's report that a West Papuan man so identified with a cassowary that he ceased to be fully human. And they would surely find it bizarre that medieval European courts punished animals for crimes. As examples like these should make clear, people have been thinking about the ethics of their relations to animals for a long time, venturing far beyond the bounds of contemporary animal rights talk in the West. What can we learn from them? Over the sweep of history, and even today, those who are not Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic make up the vast majority of humankind. If ethical values are to make serious claims on us, and if they are to be feasible, they need to reflect who we actually are. And as we will see, even the industrialized world is also shot through with people, like, for example, horse trainers, as we'll see in a moment, who might disagree with Darwin's view of human uniqueness. So let's listen to people who hunt, sacrifice, train, or just live with animals. Let them challenge and exercise our moral imaginations. Different ways of life make different viewpoints on animals plausible, different ways of interacting with them necessary, different values inhabitable, and place different demands on people. But we will also discover that certain ethical themes cut across these differences too. So one summer when I was a college kid, I took a summer job as a ranch hand in Nevada. Near the end of this job on the cattle ranch, the foreman grudgingly told me that I was getting the knack of it. My swelling pride was quickly punctured, however, when he explained that to be good at ranching, you have to think like a cow. Like others who work with animals, good hunters must be able to think, even feel like their prey. And there are both metaphysical and ethical consequences. Anthropologists had long known that for all their remarkable skills, members of small-scale societies who live by hunting and foraging are not just hard-headed pragmatists focused on the next meal. What Senior Howe found from living with Chewang hunters in the Malaysian highlands in the 1970s goes for many others. They know far more about their environment than they need just to survive. Earlier, surveying similar reports from around the world, Claude Lévi-Strauss concluded that this voracious curiosity, not limited to deliverables, exhibits something universal. He proposed that people closely observe details about the world that are of no practical use, but that help satisfy the human mind's need to make the world coherent. More recent research, however, shows that this seemingly excessive knowledge does shape people's practices. It helps them navigate a thoroughly ethical world. The Chewang language has no category of animal. Within the forest, every species has its own consciousness and moral code. According to Howell, until something has revealed itself as a personage, the Chewang have an agnostic attitude to every plant, stone, or moving creature in the forest. Each species' respective sense of morality depends on how it sees reality. This relativism is an example of a widespread phenomenon that the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro has dubbed perspectivism. Many hunting societies in the Amazon say that, from the point of view of the animal is a person, and people are animals. Far from the Amazon, in Western Canada, members of the Cree First Nation told Robert Brightman the same thing during his fieldwork in the 1980s. Such a universe cannot be ethically neutral. It is one in which you live by killing near humans. Moreover, perspectivism offers people a way to imagine a viewpoint, that of the animal, which gives them a way to see themselves as others see them. As a viewpoint onto the world, it encourages moral reflection. Imagining the viewpoint of animals is not just metaphysical speculation. It can have important consequences in practice. It might, for example, make you a better hunter, like the yukagir mimicking the elk. It also asks you to observe the ethics of a social relationship. Here's what one Cree said about going after a hibernating bear. You don't wake him up, for without good reason. You have to assure him that you don't make him die for nothing. Kind of like you're thanking him. A social relation like this constrains selfishness and acknowledges the cost to others of your survival. But why should you insist on an ethical relation with something you kill? During his fieldwork with the Kluane in the Yukon, Paul Nadasti was learning to set traps for rabbits. A novice, he botched the job, and the animal he snagged suffered a painful death. But when he expressed his feelings of guilt, an elder chastised him. saying it is disrespectful to think about an animal's suffering when you kill it. Later, another explained that it is like when someone gives you a gift. It is disrespectful to say or even think anything bad about the gift, or to imply that there's some reason why they should not have given it to you. To think about the animal's suffering, she said, is to find fault with the gift, to cast doubt on whether the animal should have given itself to you in the first place. To do this is to run the risk of giving offense and never receiving such a gift again. The social recognition we accord one another as humans applies to our relations to animals as well. It gives moral meaning to what might otherwise be just the practical demands of getting a living. But the guilt is not so easily dismissed. There is an inescapable moral paradox built into hunting. Hunters must kill. The more human-like your prey, the more problematic is this basic condition of life. A century ago, Knud Rasmussen noted that Arctic hunters like the Inuit are always aware that the greatest peril of life lies in the fact that human food consists entirely of souls. If that animal seems too much like a human, eating it can verge on cannibalism. This is why many Cree refuse bear meat, for some say bears are so like humans they even understand our language. But those Cree who avoid bear meat must still hunt or trap something else. They cannot avoid killing altogether. Should mention they live in a place where agriculture just isn't a feasible source of food. Again, the paradox is widely recognized by hunters. My life depends on another's death. They may acknowledge this even in small details of demeanor. For instance, the Hua'ulu of Indonesia prohibit combing your hair in front of freshly killed game, lest you seem to be preening yourself over your victim. Some animals make the paradox especially hard to ignore. Yukagir hunters know that the meat they most relish comes from precisely those animals who are morally most like themselves, the elk, reindeer, and bear. One hunter told Willis, when killing an elk or a bear, I sometimes feel that I've killed someone human, but one must banish such thoughts, or one would go mad from shame. One way to resolve the moral paradox is to insist that animals are our benefactors. The Cree often say that as long as the hunter respects the norms of reciprocity and gratitude, animals willingly give themselves up to him. This assures hunters they are not murderers or cannibals. Success in the hunt demonstrates that the hunter is in a proper social, spiritual relationship with the animals. Moreover, willing victims are reborn to provide future sustenance. And yet, Brightman remarks, few take this account to be entirely factual. Like the scientist who yells at our car when it won't start, or speaks of the sun rising in the east, their metaphysical theory and practical experience do not always fit neatly together. Often you can just compartmentalize them so they never conflict. Sometimes you just have to find a way to deal with the contradictions. The Cree are fully aware that animals hide, try to escape, manifest fear and pain, or even fight back, like beings unwilling to die. Cree hunters often see the encounter as a power struggle. In this light, they will attribute their success not to the animal's benevolence, but to the hunter's skill and canniness. Not the victim's gift, but the victor's triumph. Even then, however, the animal's struggle to live reveals it to be a sentient being and potentially a moral one. Short of denying that animals are sentient beings and therefore in some way like humans, there is no settled way to resolve the moral paradox. And the bare facts of the hunt, the obvious intelligence and survival instincts of the animal demonstrate that sentience. Reflecting on this paradox, Brightman writes, the question of power or the outcome of the hunt is therefore insoluble. It is posed anew and renegotiated every time a man goes into the bush with guns and traps. But one reason for treating the animals as benefactors is that the alternative would be to deny that we inhabit a morally saturated universe. The Cree aim to bring hunter and prey into a kind of moral harmony. Although this plays down the hunter's self-interest, Brightman insists that the deception is not the whole story, that self-deception is not the whole story. The people he knew feel genuine respect and gratitude. When the hunter suppresses one truth, That animals avoid death, it is in order to assert another, that hunter and prey are ethically relevant to one another. Before moving on, let's pause a moment over something Brightman is saying here, that when you are hunting an animal, your moral alignment with your prey works better than force. How should we understand this? No doubt the observational powers and well-honed techniques of Cree hunters form part of the story. Think again of the Yukagir hunter who can lure an elk through mimicry, and the Cree worldview, in which animals voluntarily give up their lives, is an important part of the answer, too. But do the Cree offer us an insight that does not require us to accept an entire metaphysical system, which at any rate they themselves may question? Yukagir, for instance, do not exist in an utterly alternate reality. Liljev notes that most of the time they do not see animals as persons at all, only when they are hunting. This suggests that it is the very act of hunting that transforms entities that are more or less thing-like into those that are more or less person-like. Prey is something you have a social relationship with. Otherwise, a wild animal is just that. Some hunters see this distinction working in reverse as well. When Eduardo Cohn was living with the Runa of the Amazon, he was warned that should you meet a jaguar, you must not look away. If you look back at the jaguar, it will realize you are something more than just potential meat. You are a potential dialogue partner. When the ranch foreman, during my summer job in Nevada, who was certainly no sentimentalist or mystic, said a good cowboy must think like a cow, he was talking about a kind of social relation. It is one in which I respond to the cow's response to me. We are continually making sense of one another by making sense of signs, movements, sounds, surroundings, and so forth. Consider this story that the primatologist, Barbara Smuts, tells about her fieldwork carrying out research with baboons. At first, the baboons would not let her get near them. Then she started paying attention to their social semiotics, how they signal to one another. This led her to adapt herself. She writes, I changed almost everything about me, including the way I walked and sat, the way I held my body, the way I used my eyes and voice. I was learning a whole new way of being in the world, the way of the baboon. I was responding to the cues the baboons use to indicate their emotions, motivations, and intentions to one another, and I was gradually learning to send such signals back to them. As a result, instead of avoiding me when I got too close, they started giving me very deliberate, dirty looks, which made me move away. Now, this may sound like a small shift, but in fact, it signaled a profound change from being treated like an object that elicited a unilateral response, avoidable, to being recognized as a subject with whom they could communicate. As Smuts learns the patterns of social interaction, she starts to make sense to the baboons. Of course, she has not become a baboon, and this certainly doesn't mean she has entered some peaceable kingdom of warm, fuzzy communing. They sometimes give her dirty looks, a lesson in proper behavior. What this shows, however, is that she is no longer ethically neutral to them. She's even something they might, in baboon fashion, address in the second person, with those dirty looks, for instance. So I'm going to skip a passage. So I have a part here because time is running out. I'm going to skip a part about animal sacrifice um, and move on to something a little closer to home. Hunters and sacrificers might seem to inhabit a world so distant from many of you that it has little to say to them. But as I suggested, there are ethical themes that should look familiar to those of us who are not hunters or sacrificers. In the contemporary Western world, owners of dogs and trainers of horses can offer lessons in the ethics of human-animal relations that sometimes seem close to those of the hunters. They also challenge the injunction, familiar to many who study animals, that we should avoid anthropomorphism. One way to gain insight into the ethical position of animals is to look at their standing in law. This is what the legal scholar Colin Dyan did in her study of several centuries of British and animal laws pertaining to dogs. Dogs are especially interesting because they've tended to stand ambiguously between wild and domestic. On the one hand, they are, as the gender mark cliche goes, man's best friend. On the other hand, unlike, say, cats or parrots, they can be dangerous and require constraints. Diane points out that this ambiguity shows up in the way contemporary American rules and institutions are split in their stance towards dogs. On the one hand, legal controls over dog ownership and canine behavior have tightened over the last century or so. Licensing, required vaccinations, lease requirements, rental restrictions, and so forth have accumulated. On the other hand, so too have pet loss hotlines, pet cemeteries, and other signs of affection. In the conjunction of fondness and force that bind humans and non-humans, you might even hear distant echoes of the Cree, Yukagir, or Chewang hunters' relation to prey. Of course, there are enormous differences among these worldviews and ways of life. For one thing, American and British dogs exist in a realm of property rights largely foreign to the world of subsistence hunters. Harm to a dog often counts as transgression against that dog's human in a way that does not apply to harm to a bear or elk. As a 1979 American court opinion put it, a pet is not just a thing, but occupies a special place somewhere in between a person and piece of personal property. But dogs become closer to the moral sphere of humans in other ways as well. In many societies, dogs, cats, and horses are accorded individual identities. This is signified, even established by the act of giving them names. An animal with a name is, at least potentially, a recognizable participant in human life that an anonymous one is not. This is not necessarily because of anything in particular that people feel about it. People have all kinds of feelings about domestic animals, including fear, anger, even hostility. But once you give someone a name, you're saying something about who they are. In English, having a name often means you will be referred to as he or she rather than it. The change of categories that namings bring about is not just a matter of how you talk about the animal. The name is more than just a label you attach to something. It is crucial to how you interact with it. Once an animal has a name, you can address it and single out him or her as the one being addressed. This is a central insight developed by the animal trainer and philosopher Vicky Hearn. She writes, "It is only when I am saying, 'Gunner, come,' that the dog has a name. Without a name and someone to call her by name, she couldn't enter the moral life. The act of addressing the dog elicits from it a response. The speaker's act and the dog's reaction put together form a social interaction. That the dog obeys the call makes that interaction part of a moral relationship." We can see variations on this insight in the lives of hunters. The Cree, for example, address bears respectfully as grandfather. So not because they see the bear as an actual reincarnation of an ancestor, nor do they treat the bear the way they would a full-fledged relative. After all, you don't hunt real kinfolk. Rather, it seems they are acknowledging a possible social relationship. The bear is the kind of being that you can address. By recognizing the bear through this simple gesture, you acknowledge a different kind of ethical stance towards it than you would towards some other animals. For Cree, bears are near humans and should be addressed as such. The act of addressing the bear in turn helps give substance to the fact of being near human. The respect it implies gives substance to its moral quality, at least for the speaker. But doesn't naming animals and talking to them tempt us to the perils of anthropomorphism and all the fuzzy thinking and sloppy sentimentalism that suggests? Well, if we listen to Hearn, the answer is yes and no. She insists that the best trainers and handlers of dogs do indeed talk in highly anthropomorphic, morally loaded language. This is not, however, because they are victims of conceptual confusion and false emotions. Hearn turns out to be a remarkably hard-headed practical philosopher. Here, for example, is what she says about dogs. By moral understanding, I mean that as far as a trainer is concerned, a dog is perfectly capable of understanding that he ought not to pee on the bedpost, even though he might want to. The dog expects to receive commands. Comparing this to how you might yell duck to a friend in peril, Hearn writes, the refusal to give commands or notice that commands are being given is often a refusal to acknowledge a relationship. It is to deny the ethical possibilities that come alive when you can address or be addressed by someone in the second person. Now, my time is up, so I think I'll end it here and open the floor if there are any questions or responses.
Hello, thank you for
Hi.
this. Very enjoyable. Or what your perspective is on why the eating relationship continues. If there seems to be more of like a acknowledgement of a social connection or a personhood element, then why would we continue that relationship? I'm interested in the anthropological answer to that.
Yeah. You mean, so why aren't we all vegetarians by now?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
basically.
Well, I sometimes wonder that myself, but I think the I think part of the answer is I think part of what I'm trying to learn from these hunters. So the hunters I talk about in the first part of the chapter are people who really don't have an alternative because they live in places where sustained agriculture is just not feasible. They live in, subarctic conditions. Um, for the rest of us, I mean, the facile answer is to say because people are trapped in habits and it's very hard to change the habits you learned as a child. That's not an interesting answer, but I think it's a true one. The more the lesson I'm trying to learn from these other folk, the hunters and the sacrificers, is that a moral relationship is not necessarily doesn't necessarily preclude acts of violence. And it's almost unimaginable for, I think, you and for me to sort of take that on board. But I think it's the truth. And I think you see this if you say, look, if you go back to Homer, Homer's Iliad, you might see something similar in the relations between the people who are fighting war against one another, that there's this kind of deep relationship that doesn't preclude acts of terrible violence. And as an anthropologist, I think that my task is really just to try to make sense of these things that are extremely hard to make sense of. So so I can't really give you a satisfying answer to the question, but what I can say is that what I find very appealing about these people is that they take responsibility for what they're doing. So the person who's buying ground chuck in a supermarket wrapped in plastic, in some sense, is living in a system which allows them to avoid taking responsibility for what was required in order for them to get their hamburger. And that to me is, in some sense, more troubling than the hunter who who recognizes a moral relationship to the animal that he or she kills. What I'm troubled by is the way in which the folks in the supermarket have developed a system that allows them to essentially blind themselves to that fact. So I think that's the best I can do for that.
Great.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
the
very much.
question. It's a good question. I'll keep wrestling with it.
Hello, hello. Yeah, super interesting talk. I wanted to hear you maybe like speculate a little bit more slash clarify kind of the bigger picture around the belief that you discussed of maybe some hunters who uh, it sounded like in their interpretative lens, success in the hunting was somehow kind of related to the quality of their relationship or maybe even the ethics of their enterprise, which of course, like to us, it sounds kind of like backwards or like maybe pointing in the wrong direction. But I wonder if, yeah, if you could like maybe expand upon this sort of like belief or like throughout history or so on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things is I've learned from these studies of hunters is that there's a kind of first of all, they are very ambivalent. They can be very ambivalent about what they're doing. So I'm fascinated by their sense of tragedy. Like I am forced to do this, even though I know there's something deeply troubling about it. I think there's something very rich about that willingness to accept the kind of tragic conditions of their lives that we have that in order to stay alive, we have to do things that we recognize are problematic. And they accept that rather than try to deny it or disguise it from themselves. Again, back to my response to the previous question, the ground meat doesn't look like it was ever an animal. That was wrapped in plastic and so forth. And so we can blind ourselves to our own responsibility. But there's a second thing that I think we can learn from them, which is that they can kind of flip a switch between, on the one hand, saying the animal gives itself to me. And so we're in a cycle of reciprocity. And this is often tied into ideas about, it will be reincarnated. If I treat it with respect, it will come back to life again, or other animals will continue to give to me. On the other hand, there's also this kind of more agonistic view in which my success is a kind of triumph, that we're in a life-death struggle, and I've won. And I think it's hard to reconcile those two, but I think that's the way moral life often is that we sometimes will favor one side. I mean, if you think about our own lives, I think we often have more than one kind of value in play in any given circumstance, and we sort of favor one in one situation and favor another in another. I mean, there's a famous quotation from the English novelist E.M. Forster, who supposedly said, "If I were asked to betray my country or betray my friends, I would rather betray my country than betray my friends." And I don't know whether he really said that, but it's been attributed to him. But what I think that's an example of is the fact that you could imagine that these are both values: loyalty to your country, loyalty to your friends. These are both values that you might take very seriously, but you may find yourself in situations where you have to make a choice between them. I think we often, we're often in situations where values are in competition with one another. And I think the hunters in some sense are doing the same thing, where they may flip under certain circumstances between one and the other. And then, sometimes when animals are not being hunted, they may just treat them as indeed this sort of morally neutral entity as well, wild animals. The typical anthropological answer to a question is it's very complicated.
Yeah.
Deeply unsatisfying, I think, but possibly true.
Yeah, fascinating. Yes, it sounds like you're pointing to this meta value, which is maybe kind of the form of mediating between different values in conflict, and maybe this is a window into that. It sounds like.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
I'm curious if you could maybe elaborate on some of your thoughts about how these ways of relating to animals might have arisen. In your answer to the first question that was posed, you talked about how people native to far northern lands that didn't have a lot of vegetation growing, had to hunt to live. But I'm sort of curious if there are other sort of reasons, like why are cultures so why are different cultures so different from each other, and why do you think that the animal why do you think that this animal rights framework that you've been talking about seems to be so prominent in weird and not in other cultures?
Well, there's a whole lot of different questions going on there, but I'll try to answer a few of them. So one of them is one aspect of the first part of your question. Why do people do this? Say, why do hunters do this? Is that I think I'm thinking about the barbus smuts and the baboons. That if you begin to treat animals as moral creatures with some kind of sentience and so forth, among other things, you get better at sort of figuring out what they're going to do. So you become a better hunter. I think a hunter who treats an animal as merely sort of this machine-like entity may not be as good at sort of figuring out where is it going to be next, what's it going to do next. I think as well that it would take too long for me to persuade you of this, other than all I can do is assert it, which I think that people do have a need to live in a value-saturated world. They need to have a sense of values, and that's going to include those things which are most important to them, namely what you have to do in order to stay alive. Um, And the fact that animals are so obviously sentient, it's hard not to see them as being moral beings. I think it takes more work to deny that they're moral beings than it would, to treat them as just things. I think it takes more work to deny that than it is to accept it. So in some sense, you might say probably, this is wild speculation, but I would imagine that probably the treatment of animals as um, mere things driven by instinct and DNA is possibly historically later than treating them as human-like. As far as why this, arises in the weird world, I have a story to tell about that, which involves partly the rise of, it has a lot to do with religious history and the rise of Protestant forms of reformism in the Abrahamic religions. There's a long story to tell there, but I would say that I think that's a big part of it. And along with that goes essentially an expansion of the moral circle, which is not as simple and straightforward and cheerful a story as some people would like to say. Because as I say in another part of the book, our moral circle expands in some ways and it shrinks in others. But all right, I'll conclude. Let me just, maybe the simplest way to tell you is this. When I was a little boy, I went to school. I was educated by Quakers. Quakers are radical egalitarians. Quakers taught me that all humans are created equal. As you grow up, you come to realize, well, it's not so obviously true as empirical experience. Some people are rich, some are poor, some are sick, some are healthy, some are happy, some are sad. They're clearly not equal in many respects. And what I had always forgotten was that the Quaker teaching didn't say all humans are created equal. It said they're all created equal in the eyes of God. So what historically had to happen is that we had to begin to posit a transcendental point of view, a view from so far away from ordinary everyday life that we could imagine a world of perfect strangers at a vast distance from us, including ultimately animals, as being part of our moral sphere, rather than those who are most immediately close to us. That goes along with the projection of a transcendental point of view. That is, it's a God-like. It starts off as God's point of view, and then it gets secularized by people like Immanuel Kant as this sort of rational, the point of view of a perfectly rational entity, but one who has been removed from the scene and looks at things from a vast distance. I just tried to compress 1,000 years of history into a few sentences, but that's the gist of it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And let's give Webb another round of applause.